Americans for their commitment in making this event possible. We are honored and thrilled indeed to host Dr. Noura Erakat for our Human Rights Day lecture today, which was delivered by Professor Seyla Ben Habib of Yale University last year, which some of you will remember. Now, Dr. Erakat's work as a scholar, editor, and public intellectual will require no introduction for many of you. Nevertheless, let me say a few words to introduce her for those who are going to witness her brilliance for the first time today. Dr. Erakat is a human rights attorney, associate professor in Africana Studies and the program in criminal justice at Rutgers University, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Religious Literacy Project at Harvard Divinity School. Dr. Erakat is the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, which was published in 2019 by Stanford University Press, which received high praise and I must say awards too for this brilliant work, which includes the Palestine Book Award and the Bronze Medal for the Independent Publishers Book Award in Current Affairs and Foreign Affairs, in Current Events and Foreign Affairs. Dr. Erakat, in addition to her work as a scholar, has served as legal counsel for a congressional subcommittee in the U.S. House of Representatives, as legal advocate for the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian refugee and residency rights, and as national organizer of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. Dr. Erakat is co-founding editor of Jadeliya and an editorial board member of the Journal of Palestine Studies. She has also produced a number of documentaries, including Gaza in Context and Black Palestinian Solidarity, which I will be showing in my class this year. As a public intellectual, she has also appeared on the media extensively, including on CBS News, CNN, Fox News, and NPR, among many other media outlets. The title of Dr. Erakat's Human Rights Day lecture this year is Dismantling the Apartheid of Our Time, the Palestinian Liberation Movement as an Anti-Racist Struggle. Now, I would like to note that this event is being audio recorded and broadcasted live over social media. Barring technical difficulties, we will soon make the recording available as video and podcast. For Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is whatever you would like, but we suggest LSE Human Rights Day. After Dr. Erakat's lecture, which will last for about 45 minutes, I will open up the floor to the audience towards what I hope will be an engaging collective discussion, which will last for another 45 minutes. Normally, we would then move towards a reception to honor Dr. Erakat, but given our new norms, that will have to wait for another year. And now, after much anticipation, please join me in welcoming Dr. Erakat to LSE, even if virtually, to deliver our annual Human Rights Day lecture of 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aisha Shubukshu, for a very kind and generous introduction. Thank you to the LSE Human Rights Program, as well as the LSE Sociology Program, and to the audience here today. This is definitely an honor. I wish that I could be with you. In addition to the fact that it's a personal honor for me to be able to deliver this lecture and to share the legacy of the Palestinian intellectual tradition in theorizing racism, in particular application to the Palestinian condition. I just want to note that it's quite an achievement to be able to center Palestinian human rights within the academy without great controversy. That in and of itself is the result of tireless advocacy and efforts on behalf of generations of Palestinians, now 7 decades and counting. And so I am honored to continue that legacy, that tradition, and hope that this builds a bridge to a future of even more mundane appearances that are not no longer deemed controversial. So thank you for that. As Dr. Shubukshu intimated, this lecture is to discuss the apartheid of our time, and particularly considering the Palestinian struggle for freedom as an anti-racist struggle. Much of this work is based on scholarship that is already published and available, as well as forthcoming scholarship, including works, co-authored work by my colleague, Professor and Dr. John Reynolds. And so you can also find references that, to this work on our academia.edu page for references. Okay, with that, let me share my screen in what is now our Zoom tradition. Here we are. Let me minimize this. Okay. Can you see this okay? All right, wonderful. So in April 2021, Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem sent shockwaves, well, April 2021 specifically Human Rights Watch, but together with B'Tselem sent shockwaves across the human rights community and political circles alike when it published a report accusing Israel of the crimes of apartheid as well as persecution. The report built on decades of the intellectual work and political advocacy of Palestinian scholars and Palestinian advocacy organizations. Notably, the Human Rights Watch report diverges, however, from those legacies in significant ways. In particular, the Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem approach is concerned with governance. It is predicated on Israel's opposition to establishing a Palestinian state and arrives at the present as an unintended outcome. The other approach is a decolonial one and has been mapped out by the Palestinian intellectual tradition. It grapples head-on with Jewish Zionist settler sovereignty and insists that Israel's racial nature is rooted in ideology and not circumstance. In this talk, I will explore the Palestinian intellectual legacies that predate the 2021 apartheid findings, with a particular emphasis on the 1975 UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination, to consider an alternative trajectory of the Palestinian freedom struggle as one against racism. In doing so, the talk will highlight the outstanding controversies among those who agree that Israel oversees an apartheid regime, and will also consider the implications of charging with Israel with apartheid at an international tribunal. So here is a nerdy roadmap of the talk to come. I'll begin by, so most of this conversation that's happened and the way that it's been emphasized specifically within the legal scholarship is on the juridical and empirical analysis of Israeli apartheid. Rather than end there, I'm going to begin there, right? Because let's just settle that question. This is not an issue. I'll then move on to, the assumption that because Israel did not establish a Palestinian state, because it did not circumscribe Zionist settler sovereignty within the 1967 or the borders or the Green Line, it therefore becomes an apartheid state. Of course, in contradistinction from the Palestinian intellectual tradition, which has insisted that Zionism in and of itself is racist, not just as forming racial discrimination, but is a racist ideology. And so I'll be presenting some of those findings and how we see them manifest specifically and debated at the United Nations during the debate on Resolution 3379 in the fall of 1975. Then I'll loop back. So see how this roadmap begins in the present, heads us, stepping a little bit back towards the torpedoing of the Palestinian state, goes back historically, but then back into the present of how then, especially since the collapse of Oslo, how has that collapse also established a road back to a pointed critique of Zionism, using legal analysis as a way to scale the fortress that Oslo built, around Zionism as a concept, fortified and protected from critique, bringing us into the landmines that we experience today. Is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, why or why not? Very much highlighting that these are not new debates, but actually ones that are resurrected, that have historically been settled, that we are grappling with once again on new grounds. I'll end with kind of the horizon. What are the outstanding issues regarding race, and what are the utility of legal strategies? So let's begin with what we seemingly know in the apartheid discussion. Here we have a map of the partition plan in 1947. So this would be the 1947 lines, then the 1967 line or the 1948 armistice lines in the center, and then obviously the non-contiguous territories that are known as the Bantustans that today make up the West Bank, which not just Netanyahu but also Naftali Bennett have basically said that even in this discontiguous formation, there will never be a Palestinian state. But they will continue to pursue a policy of containment, and basically what we've seen laid out since the 1978 Middle East peace process between Israel and Egypt, consecrated in 1979, again resurrected in Oslo in the Declaration of Principles in 1993, of what will be Palestinian autonomy, or our reservations or Bantustans. Now, this is what we know geographically, because apartheid is not only legal, social, political, but it is geographic in that it establishes these spatial separations. But here I want to point you to the juridical. And this is what Badil, the Legal Resource Center for Refugee and Residency Rights, submitted to the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 2012, where it went beyond merely the two legal systems of the military legal system in the West Bank and Gaza, and then the civil system within Israel. It went to the core of the matter to demonstrate that the bifurcation between Jewish nationality and Israeli citizenship throughout all of Israel and the Palestinian territories, the entire territory under Israel's singular jurisdiction from the Mediterranean Sea to the River Jordan, establishes a singular apartheid regime, tantamount to apartheid condemned under Article 3 of the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So to just walk you through this, what Badil asserted in 2012 is that the apartheid regime is predicated on this bifurcation of Jewish nationality and Israeli citizenship, because within Israel there is no such thing as an Israeli national. The Law of Return of 1950 defines a Jewish national as someone born of a Jewish mother or has become converted to Judaism and is not a member of any other religion. The Law of Return extraterritorialized Jewish nationality and conferred exclusive rights to Jewish nationals to enter Israel, to obtain citizenship, to settle anywhere within Israel's jurisdiction, including the West Bank settlements. The legal framework of Jewish nationality effectively affords Jewish persons anywhere in the world more rights than the Palestinians, whose presence preceded Israel's establishment, including those who were not exiled and became citizens of the state. Subsequently, the Nationality Law of 1952, better understood as the citizenship law, because the law affords automatic citizenship to Jewish nationals while denying citizenship and residency rights to Palestinians who were driven out, repealed the Palestinian Citizenship Order of 1925 and resulted in the de facto denationalization of the entire Palestinian population. This rendered stateless the Palestinian refugees driven from their homes in the 1948 war, as well as those resident in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. The Law of Return, together with the Nationality Law, established a tiered order that distinguishes between Israel's population, who are both nationals and citizenship, from its Christian and Muslim Palestinian population, who are citizens only. This is within Israel. So that there you can see that in the center under citizenship, that even among, this is how Palestinians are divided, whereas there's a singular category of Jewish nationals who then expand their rights as citizens, but have all those rights afforded to them by virtue of their nationality. Again, in distinction from the Palestinians who are not citizens, not Palestinian citizens, and who do become citizens of Israel, are still denied many rights because they are never eligible for Jewish nationality. Then, in distinction from those Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and those Palestinians in Gaza, and those Palestinians in the West Bank, and those Palestinians in exile. Adala, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, maintains an ongoing database of laws and currently totaling 65 laws that prima facie discriminate Palestinians on the basis of national belonging. Israel's binary system enables the state to achieve its stated goal of maintaining a significant Jewish majority, even in the face of natural population growth. In particular, the bifurcation facilitates a policy of forced population transfer. The most blatant pillar of that policy is Israel's denial of Palestinian refugees, totaling some 5.7 million, the right to return to their homes and lands, which the state frames as an existential threat to the country. Other laws include the ban on family reunification, 2003, the Admissions Committee Law, 2011, the 2010 Amendment to the Negev Development Authority, and the 2009 Israel Land Administration of Law. Forced population transfer, together with other discriminatory policies also predicated on the exclusive right to Jewish nationality, violate Articles 2C and 2D of the Apartheid Convention. This brings us to a very elaborate legal analysis of the violation of the Apartheid Convention. This chart is one piece of it. There have been multiple reports on this topic, including the hundreds-page report submitted to ESQA by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, including the Human Rights Watch report, including the multiple reports by the Palestinian advocacy organizations like Al-Haq, as well as what was submitted to the Russell Tribunal in the tribunal in South Africa, and so on and so forth. But let us come back to the 1973 Apartheid Convention that declared for the first time racism in the form of apartheid as a crime of humanity. Now, one of the ways that we've conceived of racism in the present is to create some sort of historical revisionism, that it was primarily a domestic problem within South Africa, that this was about racial discrimination practiced by one state that was so obscene, in a way that obscures the way that this kind of racism is actually, international in scope and not limited to South Africa, as much was declared by the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in 1995, but two, and more significantly, that this wasn't just a problem of racism, but apartheid was a colonial project, right? It's that international dimension that gets lost in the domestication of all racial analyses, especially in the present, as we conceive of racism as a governance issue to be overcome by countries that are going to achieve their full potential in overcoming it through some sort of juridical resolution. But South African apartheid was fundamentally a settler colonial project intent on removing Black Africans, albeit internally, as opposed to the external displacement characterizing Palestinian removal, expropriating their lands, concentrating them into small territories known as Bantustans, and supplanting their indigenous sovereignty with Afrikaner sovereignty. South African apartheid was far more than the white supremacist project we remember it for, contained with domestic borders. Its proponents also understood it as a movement for Afrikaner self-determination against British oppression on a land without a people, meaning no recognized juridical people with the right to self-determination. The connection between Zionism and apartheid reflects in part their common origins within the crucible of British Empire. Richard P. Stevens highlights that the group of politicians responsible for the successful adoption of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, designating Palestine as a site of Jewish settlement, namely Lord Balfour, Lord Milner, Joseph Chamberlain, General Jan Smuts, and Lord Selborne, were also central to the passage of the South African Act of Union in 1909. At the core of both initiatives was the advancement of Western imperial interests in the African continent, as well as the Middle East. European Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann and Theodor Herzl understood this well as they appealed to Turkish, British, and German leaders for the right to settle in Palestine, arguing that settlement in Palestine would, quote, form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism, end quote. Zionists continued to argue that Zionism is also a national project of Jewish self-determination, thus distinguishing it from any racist project. However, as articulated by Abdin Jabara very clearly in 1979, quote, there's only one conditional rule attached to the right of national liberation. No man or people may achieve national liberation at the expense of another people. Given this fact, any movement, including Zionism, which seeks to solve the national problem of one people at the expense of another, may not properly be called a movement for national liberation. While the international community slowly and belatedly moved to isolate the South African regime. And I have to emphasize here that overcoming South African apartheid was not, easy, kumbaya, but in fact was quite entrenched. The US's issuance of vetoes to protect a state, particularly to protect the apartheid regimes in South Africa and Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, is only second to the issuance of its vetoes to protect Israel. But France, the UK also issued vetoes, also issued its votes to, not vetoes, but its votes to protect the South African apartheid regime, urging that the process be more civilized, that there not be such reactionary movements, and also oppose these grassroots movements to end the apartheid of that time, right? So it too was an entrenched battle. Israel sustained, however, as boycott gained traction across the world, Israel sustained the South African apartheid economy through the development of a robust arms industry, a covert arms industry. The South African government regarded Israel as a fellow country under siege, quote, situated in a predominantly hostile world inhabited by dark peoples, end quote. In 1973, the UN General Assembly condemned the, quote, unholy alliance between Portuguese colonialism, South African racism, Zionism, and Israeli imperialism. 2 years later, the UN would condemn Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination in Resolution 3379, placing it squarely within the agenda of the Decade Against Racism, originally conceived to dismantle apartheid, African apartheid, and I'll get back to that. But here's the detour that takes place. The international community achieved the mandate of dismantling apartheid in South Africa within the span of 2 decades. But at the very moment of South African and Namibian liberation, Zionist settler colonization and apartheid found a new lifeline in the Oslo peace process. So let's move to that. Now, what I want to show you here is actually, if we actually go back to this map. So the idea was that Oslo, if Zionist settler sovereignty could just be contained within the 1967 border and a Palestinian state could be established on the West Bank and Gaza, the idea was that there would be international sanction for whatever discrimination, for whatever displacement of refugees, to normalize those violences within Israel as established up until the establishment of the 1949 armistice lines in March 1949. That was the idea. This goes back into the drafting history of UN Security Council Resolution 242. I'm happy to answer questions about that. Here's what's significant about this, is that Israel had that opportunity to preserve its Zionist settler sovereignty, but it single-handedly torpedoed the opportunity to do so in the following ways. This is what it created of what would have been the West Bank, and instead of some 20 non-contiguous Bantustans or reservations, however you want to describe them. The blue land masses are Area C. These are jurisdictional categories that were created by the peace process. Checkpoints are an invention of the peace process. This part, the part that I don't know if you can see you can't. The blue part on the easternmost border, the Jordan Valley, is 30% of the West Bank, and that is what has already been declared de facto annexed and was going to be de jure annexed under the Trump administration, but for the resistance of the international community, but the de facto annexation remains. Here we have that Israel increased its settler population from 200,000 to 600,000 in the West Bank, and it built the annexation wall that runs primarily into the West Bank and confiscates another 13% of the territory. As I said, it oversees the de facto annexation not only of the Jordan Valley, but all of Area C, or 60% of the West Bank, and has stated explicit expansion, intention of de jure annexation. It's declared sovereignty over East Jerusalem, where it prohibits Palestinian travel and presence between the West Bank and Gaza. It securitized the 2 million person population in the Gaza Strip and continues a policy of forced population transfer to undermine Palestinian cohesion in order to maintain a Jewish national majority. Beyond that, here we have the creation of yet more security technology to circumscribe Gaza that, fits into an entirely different discussion, which I'm happy to entertain in the Q&A. But I want to end by showing that this form of removal, concentration, and dispossession of Palestinians also exists within Israel proper, where Israel continues a settlement policy directed not only at the Palestinians in the West Bank today, but also the Palestinians in the south of Israel, or the Negev desert. Israel has made clear to the world what Palestinians have long known, is that it wants the land without the people and wants to remain the sole source of authority from the river to the sea. The Human Rights Watch report concluding that Israel oversees an apartheid regime is more of an acknowledgement than a revelation of its existence, and it continues the rich line of resources and intellectual offerings that Palestinians has made. Even the title's report, A Threshold Crossed, reflects that Israel has removed any plausible deniability of its intention to remain the sole sovereign, and at best to offer Palestinians the opportunity to govern themselves in autonomous zones, equivalent to North American reservations in Canada as well as the United States, as well as South African homelands, the latter which were condemned as, quote, white minority domination aimed at possessing the African people of South Africa their inalienable rights in 1976, but in the case of Palestine, are seen as a pathway to peace. At issue in 2021 is not whether Israel oversees an apartheid regime, but whether the international community is willing to acknowledge it and take responsibility for its dismantlement. The obstinate refusal to do so reflects a commitment to Zionist settler sovereignty as the optimal solution to combating anti-Jewish bigotry, as well as an often explicit expectation that Palestinian life is expendable and well worth the cost of that endeavor. Under the liberal framework, Israel became an apartheid state. It was a dream, a Zionist dream that became a Frankenstein, right? But this would be a misreading of the situation, as it assumes that the problem is one of governance rather than ideology. Israel did not become a discriminatory regime. It is defined by that discrimination. This is not the unintended outcome, but is precisely the outcome we should have expected, and Palestinians have been showing us will become the outcome. And a return to the Palestinian intellectual tradition will demonstrate as much. So here I have a crude periodization of that intellectual tradition that shows that between 1948 and 1967, Palestinian literature on this topic again and again demonstrates that Zionism is a form of racism. It forms internal colonization and exclusion. This is writers like Fayez Sayegh, Hassan Saab, and others that I've not, Sabri Jirias, and others that you can find actually in the pages of the Journal of Palestine Studies. In post-1967, when we see this dual system applied, that's when this critique becomes even more popular and acceptable because of the establishment of a military regime and a civilian regime. Since 1993, we clearly see the autonomous zones geographically in what analysts have increasingly called the Bantustanization of Palestinian territory, yet another period of articulating an apartheid framework. And from 2000 to the present, we have seen a walk back to a critique of Zionism to scale the Oslo fortress in the ashes of Oslo, which I argue have de facto collapsed since 2001. And yet the farce of it continues. We'll discuss that. So this tradition is quite rich. What I want to do is just walk us through that first period, right? Because it's what lays the groundwork for all the decades to come. And it's in fact what lays the groundwork for the debate at the United Nations in 1975. So let me go back now to the drafting history of 3379. That resolution was introduced in the Third Committee at the 29th General Assembly. The Third Committee is responsible for social, humanitarian, and cultural issues and was continuing its work, its decade for action to confront racism and racial discrimination, what I'll describe as the decade against racism. African states initiated the decade in 1972 to target apartheid in South Africa. Participating states, however, said that the mandate should be expanded to target racism, apartheid, racial discrimination, and the liberation of all peoples under colonial domination and alien subjugation. It's in this context, in October 1975, that Somalia, on behalf of a coalition of states, introduced an amendment to the Decade Against Racism. Resolution 2157, introduced in the Third Committee, proposed that the word Zionism be inserted into the Decade Against Racism wherever apartheid, colonialism, and racial discrimination appeared. 2 weeks later, Somalia withdrew the amendment only to submit a more robust amendment, Resolution 2159, that not only moved to insert Zionism into the same places, but now was backed by all of the regional conferences throughout the summer of 1975, convened at the International Women's Conference in Mexico, at the Organization of Islamic Conference in Jeddah, at the Organization of African Unity in Kampala, at the Non-Aligned Movement convening in Lima, Peru, where each of these four regional international and regional conferences concluded that Zionism was a form of racism and racial discrimination. So this was clearly a movement across the globe that then permeated to the top at the UN. What we find in the Third Committee documents, and so this is also in a forthcoming work that I have in a volume that is being co-edited by Lana Tautour and Ronit Lenton. I look at the Third Committee documents as well as the General Assembly plenary debates of how this was discussed. And I find that there are at least three ways that members of the United Nations theorized Zionism or created a racial theory of Zionism in this time. The strands are anti-imperialist, domestic discrimination, which is the one we're most familiar with today, and supremacist ideology. So just to say that anti-imperialism was the most fervent in 1975. Domestic discrimination is the one we tend to associate with racism today. And Zionism as supremacist ideology is as controversial today as it was then. And that's what we'll look at. So as to the first, the self-identified third world considered the denial of Arab Palestinian sovereignty like its denial amongst all colonized people of racial matter. The League of Nations mandate system established after the First World War had predicated eligibility for sovereignty on proximity to European models of government and society. And this is laid out quite brilliantly but in the work of Anthony Enke and others of the third world approaches to international law. An observation of the subjugation of colonized people throughout the 1930s, including the League's role in sustaining it, Black Anglophone revolutionary scholars theorized that colonialism represented a dual structure of enslavement and international racial hierarchy. W.E.B. Du Bois explained that this racial capitalist structure was subjected colonized peoples to conditions of unfreedom for, quote, the benefit of the white people of the world, end quote. In 1960, in its capacity as an automatic majority at the UN, the non-aligned bloc successfully condemned colonialism as an illegitimate system of governance and established that self-determination was tantamount to national liberation. Third world nations and nation states also considered Israel's establishment as an imperial imposition that effectively divided the African and Asian continents from one another without their participation, buy-in, or acquiescence. This analysis crystallized further as Israel aligned itself with other imperial powers, particularly South Africa, but also Portugal and the United States during this time. So this anti-imperialist thread, and colonialism as racism, is the one that animates the third world the most and creates cohesion amongst them. But another widely accepted critique of Zionism is that it's a form of racial discrimination. And here, and this becomes the one that's most accepted today and reflected in the Human Rights Watch report, for example, which is that regardless of intent, that the outcome is that Israel distinguishes between its Jewish Israelis and all others, particularly Palestinians, and that this kind of racism features across all societies, and it can be dismantled through juridical strategies. This, of course, fails to consider the colonial nature of Zionism and what animates it and what undergirds this racial discrimination, not only as an outcome, but as something that's just and righteous, as argued by political Zionists. So this brings us to our third and most controversial topic, which is that Zionism is a supremacist ideology. Now, this is articulated most clearly by Fayez Sayegh, a Palestinian academic. He's also the director of the PLO Research Center at the time. He represents the Kuwaiti delegation to the United Nations and is the engine behind 3379. He is careful to show that beyond its colonial practice, Zionism is racist, and he focuses on three pillars that make it such. One, racial segregation, racial exclusiveness, and racial supremacy. Sayegh points to the writings of leading Zionists to illuminate how self-segregation within an exclusive Jewish state is an aversion to assimilation within non-Jewish societies. He then demonstrates how racial exclusivity, which is also a form of racial purity, is the force that propels Palestinian removal and precludes cohabitation with them. Finally, Sayegh concludes that segregation and exclusivity make possible the manifestation of Jewish superiority, fundamentally rooted in the belief that Jews are God's chosen people. Sayegh and his peers are well aware that the concept of a Jewish race is a cornerstone of secular European anti-Semitism. Europe's racialized exclusion of Jews was predicated on Orientalist conception of Jews as backward, dirty, religious, and unfit for modernity. It is precisely what led to Nazi insistence, among others, that Jews cannot be integrated into national society, thus rendering them ineligible for whiteness and exogenous by definition. As Edward Said would later put it, quote, the militant concept of a Jewish race derived itself not simply from the age-old persecution of Jews in Christian Europe, but from the racial topologies of Gobineau, Stuart Chamberlain, and Renan. In a companion pamphlet at this time, in 1965, Palestinian scholar Hassan Saab critiques Eastern European Zionists for seeking the revival of a Jewish nation rather than defense of the rights of individual Jews. In response to anti-Semitism, he dismisses Zionist concept of a Jewish race as a myth, on par with the concept of a German race. He highlights how racial consciousness led both ideologies to believe in, quote, a special historic destiny, and although quote, the deadly struggle between Zionism and Nazism should have made such similarities unthinkable, anti-Semitism, Zionism, and Nazism were various forms of nationalism and racism nurtured in a similar geography and in the same intellectual climate. Hence, and ironically, Saab highlights that both anti-Semites and Zionists believe that Jewish integration is an impossibility, and Jews must have a state of their own. In the Third Committee, and later in the General Assembly, it is this uncomfortable and disturbing connection that made claim that Zionism is racism so controversial. Even among the resolution's most fervent proponents, support for it reflected a belief that Zionism is a bedfellow of imperialism or that Palestinians endured discrimination at the hands of Israel, but the flashpoint remained whether Zionism was indeed a form of racism. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Patrick Moynihan, at the time summed up this dissonance very angrily when he said to the plenary, whatever Zionism may be, it is not and cannot be a form of racism. He then cited the Oxford Dictionary and the Webster's Third New International Dictionary to define racism as a biological distinction that stratifies humanity and affords a particular group superior status with the right to dominate others. He goes on to show that Zionism is a strictly political movement born in the late 19th century in the context of the upsurge of national, which gives birth to the Jewish national liberation movements, whose members are defined by belief rather than by birth. Zionist, Moynihan explains, are Jews, self-defined as anyone born to a Jewish mother, and he continues that this is an absolutely crucial fact. Anyone who converted to Judaism Moynihan's emphasis on Jewish conversion is meant to show that unlike other categories enumerated in the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Jewish identity is not a biological category. He goes on to highlight the racial stocks, Middle Eastern and Black Jews, to demonstrate that Israel is actually racially diverse, so that there cannot be a single Jewish race to speak of. Now, here I want to point you to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, which is a deep source of the controversy that continues to this day for failure to be able to articulate what is race, what is racism. The convention doesn't define race or racism, but does define racial discrimination. And as you'll see, here is the clause that defines racial discrimination. What you get is that this definition compounds the ambiguity over the meaning of race, first by distinguishing it from other immutable categories, namely color, descent, or ethnic origin, and second by suggesting that a state can racially discriminate on a basis other than race. The convention deliberately does not enumerate any particular forms of racism, with the singular exception of apartheid. And what's ironic about all this is that the impetus for the drafting of the ICERD was actually anti-Semitic outbreaks in Germany at the time. It is what launches, it is what propels the desire to draft a convention against racism, which was met with controversy at the drafting stage. There was broad agreement that anti-Semitism constituted a form of racism, but a lot of controversy over whether or not to also name Nazism, to also name Zionism, how it would be named, in what clause it would be named. And ultimately, anti-Semitism doesn't get named in the Convention Against Racism, and instead, the final convention bifurcated Convention Against Racism, which is what we see here, and a separate convention on religious freedom, where anti-Semitism is named. The lack of a definition of race and racism created significant room for political maneuver, as well as genuine confusion in the 1975 UN deliberations. In his capacity as the representative of Kuwait, Sayer repeatedly and tirelessly made the case against Zionism. He responded to Moynihan when he pointed to the ICERD's expansive definition to say that it could be based on racism, can be based on descent, as well as ethnic and national origin. He continued that Zionist ideology is racist, that Jews are not merely a faith, but are sutured and united by membership in an ethnic community that had the right to create an exclusive state in the place of another people. He then said that if you cannot show that Zionists wanted Jews to be considered a matter of race, it would be impossible to speak of racism. And then to answer his own challenge, he cites Zionist thinkers and leaders, including the founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, to show that the Zionist conception of Jewishness, quote, had nothing to do with religion. It was the racial link that made a Jew, thereby responding directly to Moynihan that this was not an immutable category, that it was not something that was based on birth, but instead was merely a matter of conversion and political decision. As for diverse racial stocks, Sayer explained that racism is like a cancer that defines containment. And once Zionism had racialized non-Jews in Palestine, it soon came to draw a color line or a racial line among Jews themselves, far from establishing racial diversity. As argued by Ambassador Moynihan, the subjugation of Middle Eastern and Black Jews exposed the, quote, Zionist myth of one Jewish people and demonstrated the supremacy of the white Jewish establishment. Significantly, Sayer emphasized that unlike anti-Semitism, political Zionism referred to the juridical policy embodied by an actual state. Indeed, while all states practice racism, Israel was among a minority that defined itself upon that basis. And here is a primary distinction, and one that I'm sure will come up in Q&A by those who want to say, but all states are racist. The United States is racist. Brazil is racist. Canada, yes, all states are racist, are presumptively racist. Israel defines itself upon that distinction in ways that many other states are attempting to do today under the banner of democracy, right? When Richard Spencer says that he wants to follow the model of Israel in order, for the future of European sovereignty so that, the US can be declared a white state, right? That is through a democratic pathway. for the Hindutva pathway of India being a place where it's righteous that it belonged firstly and foremostly to Hindu Indians. This is not unique, but the ability to define a country upon that discrimination and the fact that we uphold and protect it is quite unique. When the declaration for action finally came to vote, when this was very controversial, there were a number of procedural maneuvers. There was a split amongst Black African states. The large majority of them supported this, and so on and so forth. I'm happy to discuss that. But ultimately, the resolution, the amendment to amend the Decade Against Racism passed with a strong majority of 72 to 35, with 32 abstentions. The PLO would rescind the resolution in 1991 as a precondition for entering into the Oslo peace process. So we enter into Oslo, where I showed you we began what lays the pathway for permanent Palestinian autonomy and occupation. So I argue that Oslo has become our sovereignty, a Palestinian sovereignty trap. And I borrow from indigenous scholarship on this issue. A number of indigenous scholars in North America have highlighted how sovereignty as a pathway to freedom has actually created a condition of permanent subjugation. So I borrow from that thinking, Audra Simpson, Glenn Poultard, Nick Estes, and others, to basically show Keolani Ka'unui, to show that a Palestinian sovereignty trap is the permanent condition of proving eligibility for self-rule to a settler sovereign in the hopes of achieving independence, but rewarded only with limited privileges, ad hoc reprieves, and greater authority to police Palestinians for the sake of protecting Israelis. More significant, perhaps, is how the bilateral structure of the political negotiations framed as peacemaking obfuscated the very power dynamic that defined the so-called conflict and cast Palestinian resistance in all of its forms. BDS, mass protests, the Gaza March of Return, legal advocacy as terroristic.